If all the other things we've seen in the book of Matthew are true, then it is mind-blowing what happens in Matthew 27, verse 50, just 50 even. It says, "And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit." That's clearly language for death, and the rest of the context indicates that, yeah, that little euphemism, that expression that we'll talk about more in a minute, it means he died. What in the world? How can all the other stuff be true and that be true? It keeps feeling, the closer you get to the cross, like there's going to be some bailout that happens. Something's going to work out. But if you step even further back from just the narrative beats that demonstrate the power of Jesus, then you understand what that thing is. The missing point in the equation that I just threw out is that he's not playing the same game you and I are playing, which is prolong our lives and avoid pain and suffering and make sure we're vindicated whenever it's possible at all costs. He is clearly, willingly laying down his life. What a stunning moment that it finally happened, that it actually came to this. In a way, this, I suppose, is vindication because he said this is what was going to happen, but all of his power, all of his behavior, all of his social sense made it look like he could have avoided this whenever he wanted to. He could walk right through that crowd of people who wanted to do roughly the same thing to him in Nazareth. He could theoretically just do that again. In fact, he says as much just a chapter earlier in Matthew 26. He tells Peter to put his sword back in its place because everybody who draws a sword will die by the sword. But then he goes on. Remember this, Matthew 26:53. He says, "Do you think I cannot call on my Father and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But then how would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?" He says it even more explicitly over in John 10, 17, and 18. Now I'm going to go all the way back to 14. He says in John 10:14, "I'm the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that aren't of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason the Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father." Okay, so on the one hand, this is clearly happening to Jesus. There's moral culpability for it. That's all over the text. So someone is inflicting this on him. But in this weird intersection between the divine, the providential that is, and the human, what looks like free will, we're getting this mingling of human action, but also God-ordained unfolding of events, God willing that this would be the thing that would occur. And the intersection of those two things is Jesus is now on the cross in our trip through the book of Matthew, lifeless. But we've got Matthew using this unusual phrase, he gave up his spirit. Now, unusual, there are versions of this phrase that we still use today when somebody dies and gave up the ghost. Some translations even say it that way. But what does it mean here in light of this theology and the stuff that we're looking at in context? Okay, one way to read it would be to assume that we're talking about maybe the Holy Spirit here, and that somehow this is indicative of a next step in the relationship within the Trinity, and this is some kind of precursor to what we're going to see in a matter of days here at the beginning of Acts, at the day of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit shows up. But I think that's a big-time stretch. It doesn't seem to be drawing on the same original language. It just sort of maybe looks like it in English. I don't think we're getting any kind of theology like that going on here. Possibility number two is that this is just an expression for dying that existed in the ancient world and has found some continued life, some continued legs, because it's so famous in this passage that people have used it since. But it was just a euphemism. I'm not trying to be crass at all in a day where we're looking at the most somber verse in the entire book of Matthew. But we have phrases for dying like kick the bucket, bit the dust. I don't know. Humans have always come up with stuff like this because dying's this weird specter that looms out at the horizon of life, and we try to make light of it, but deep down we're all fairly concerned about it. And even though it's the most natural thing ever, it's also the most unnatural thing ever, because it feels like we were made for a lot more than the lifespans we get. And so maybe this is just human nature here coming through, and there was a saying floating around back then. I went and dug around a little bit in Josephus. I had heard rumors that this same kind of language was used there. It was not very hard for me to dig up examples of that. Do I even want to bother to read them to you? Yeah, I suppose I could real quick. This is about Judas Maccabees. I mean, in a way, sort of a messianic figure. And this is the account of his death in the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 13, line 430. So not being able to fly, but he and those who were with him fought. And when he had slain a great many of those that came against him, he at last was himself wounded and fell and gave up the ghost and died in a way like to his former famous actions. And I suppose I could read you more of these, but there are a handful of examples, and this clearly was an expression Josephus used. Clearly he expected his audience to know what it meant. So I guess gave up the ghost was an expression. Well, are we to believe that Judas Maccabees had control over that? It doesn't sound like it in that passage by Josephus. That extra biblical source seems to be using that phrase in a way that says he got killed, people wounded him, and at some point he couldn't stay alive anymore. He ran out of gas and he died. There's certainly a lot of dignity in this euphemism that makes it sound like something that usually takes away our agency, death. That's how we think of it. There's real dignity in this phrase. It makes it sound like the person who dies has some kind of agency in a thing that strips us of agency. So I like it. It's got some class to it, but is Matthew saying here that this thing happened to Jesus and he just died like anybody else? Well, yeah, it could be that he's saying that. It really could be that he's saying this is a normal human death. When you do that to a normal human body, they die. And the act of laying down his life that we looked at, flipping back to Matthew 26 and flipping over to John 10, the act of laying down his life voluntarily happened when he decided to go to Jerusalem, when he didn't flee, when he refrained from using his miraculous power to solve all of these temporary problems. That's when he made the decision to willingly lay down his life. He isn't making that decision in a miraculous way here where he's like, nope, not doing it, not doing it, not doing it. Now I will do the miracle of allowing myself to die. It could be that Matthew's just saying he died. That would be very in keeping with how Matthew is presenting Jesus as here, fully God, fully man, entirely in a physical body with the physical limitations that come with that, yet somehow still imbued with the power of God, even though clearly in a restrained way, we get a little peek in Matthew 17 with the transfiguration. That's Matthew tipping his hand to be like, hey, there was a lot more to Jesus. We were getting a rather intentionally muted, meek, restrained version for the purposes of what he was trying to do here. So option number one for this phrase, gave up his spirit, would be that somehow we're talking about the Holy Spirit. I just don't think there's any merit to that read whatsoever. Option number two is to say this is a well-known euphemism that just has to do with death, and it's a way to signal from Matthew to his audience that Jesus just died, like people die. Option number three is that Matthew is using a phrase that people associate with the involuntary nature of death, but in the theological and narrative context of Matthew 27, he's repurposing that phrase a little bit to suggest that Jesus did have a say, that he is so master of death that he wasn't having his life stripped from him even after all this abuse. He did the things he needed to do. He said the things he needed to say. We have "it is finished" in other accounts, and he's done. This is the fullness of time. This is when this was supposed to happen. And in a way, there is a miraculous move happening here with Jesus, who is master over death and has power over death, allows himself to be consumed in death in this moment. and we are to read this as though he is voluntarily giving up his spirit, even here in this final moment of his death. How do you want to read it? Again, I would just ignore that first option. I think it was important for us to dismiss it, but I think you can make a good case for either of the two other options. This is a euphemism, and Jesus died a normal but horrific death, and death got him like death gets other people. It just didn't get him for very long, and he's going to overcome it as predicted. Or you could read it as, even in this moment, he waited until the moment was right, said the things he needed to say, did the things he needed to do. He'd finished everything he needed to accomplish, and then he voluntarily releases his spirit, gives himself over to death for this interim. And I'm more than comfortable saying interim, because now we've done the part where Jesus dies, and now we're going to flip around and start to immediately see the ramifications of that. And we are on the narrative downhill to when he is back on screen, alive and well, conquering death. And the text is going to hold this out as being the punchline of the whole book, that Jesus initiates this kingdom by defeating death, and that somehow there's this new family of faith, and by the righteousness of Jesus, not the righteousness of you, you are invited to be a son, a daughter, a child, an heir, an agent of this kingdom, a kingdom that is so great, ruled by a king who is so great that even death cannot thwart it and cannot defeat it. I'm pretty excited for the next stretch. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.